Hi, I'm Carl Taylor and welcome to this in-depth review of the brand new Hasselblad X2D Mark II. I've had this camera as a beta tester for a couple of months now. That's allowed me to put it through its paces on a variety of shoots on location, some fashion shoots, some low light shoots, high ISO tests, stabilization tests, focusing tests, a whole bunch of stuff that I'm going to talk about, and we're going to dig deep and we're going to find the ghost in the machine. Now, a couple of things to talk about first of all is we've got the original X2D here and the new one here. So I'm not going to go over every single feature that the camera has that already exists in the X2D, because we already have an excellent video on this channel that covers in depth all of the features of the X2D. So what we're going to do is we're going to dig deep into the upgrades on this camera and increased performance functions, areas where I think it's excelled, areas where I think things haven't changed maybe. And there is actually one little caveat in this, one thing that we're going to dig into that you probably won't see in other reviews. One small point about this camera that I discovered during my testing. And incidentally, this new camera is listed at $7,400 compared to the previous model at $8,200. Okay, so I've got a list in front of me here because there's quite a few things to cover that you guys are going to be interested in. Just for clarity, as many of you know, I'm an ambassador for Hasselblad, have been for many years. I've been using the Hasselblad system since the H1 back in 2005. However, I have complete independence from Hasselblad with my reviews and what I want to say about their kit, and that's exactly what I'm going to do here. Also in the review is the brand new 35-100 lens. This actually impressed me incredibly, not only in its capabilities, but also value for money compared to a photographer having to buy 3 or 4 prime lenses to cover what this does. But we'll get into that as well in due course. Let's start off with the camera. By the way, I've got some amazing results. As I said, I've shot loads of test images over the past couple of months, testing everything. And the results are superb, and we're going to get to look at those and look at some of those shoots as well. Let's just start with the aesthetics, the things that you might notice straight away. First of all, both cameras are pretty much the same. They look the same. The shape, the layout, the feel, that lovely high quality block-like feel of the Ergonomics remains the same, remains really nice. The grip on this one has a slightly better grip texture, I would say. It's slightly different to the X2D, so the Mark II has got a different texture on that material around the handhold part. The key features in terms of the sort of ergonomics on this addition of this incredible joystick on the back here, which allows us a whole bunch of extra functionality, which I'll come to, and also the screen. There's a new screen which has got more movement, more tilt, more flip out option as well. Other than that, the camera feels pretty much the same. You will notice looking at the front, there's a couple of little different areas down here to do with the focusing, because the focusing has got some new additional tech in there which greatly improves the focusing on the camera. So let's work down my list. So first of all, as we've spoken about the appearance, it's a different color. It's now, I would say the old one was black before. This one is a dark sort of gunmetal gray. And according to Hasselblad, it's got a new sort of coating technique that is more durable on the metal body. I've never had any issues with the previous one, so I didn't really notice any coating problems on the previous one, but they're saying that this one has got a more durable coating. The other thing stated with the overall camera is a weight reduction. So the body is apparently 50 grams lighter than the previous body, but again, nothing that I could really notice or feel in using it. The battery position is the same, everything else, the way that operates and flips out, but apparently the battery's got 9 or 10% longer life than the existing one, so that's obviously a welcome addition. The screen, let's move on to the screen. So if we take a look at the screen here, what you'll notice, if I get the old one as well, if I flip out the old one only flipped out like that. Can't get it to go anywhere else. It's just down and up, and that's it. Now with the new one, it goes down, up, and it comes out, and it angles backwards down like that as well. So if you're shooting overhead shots or, you know, unusual angles or lower to the ground, you know, this thing is flipping out now right out at that angle, which the other one, as you can see, couldn't do. So side by side comparison there means if I'm shooting at ground level, I can still look down on this almost like a waist level finder on the old Hasselblad cameras. I can look straight down on top of that. So that is really useful. Very happy about that. Some people are going to probably comment on why doesn't it flip around to the side so I can take selfies. Well, you know, this isn't really the sort of camera for taking selfies. This is top of the line pro level photography kit that, you know, is there to deliver the best images possible. But I am very happy about the additional movement that this screen offers, because the last screen was quite limited, especially if you were doing those low-level shots or high-level shots and looking for unusual positions. So that's a big bonus as well. The main thing with this camera for me, as a professional user, conducting fashion shoots on location or in the studio, it doesn't really affect my product photography because I'm working tethered and manually focusing. But for fashion and beauty work, the focusing system is massively improved and definitely noticeable. I shot with both cameras on some shoots to get the feel for the differences, and immediately you can tell the improvements on the focusing with the X2D Mark II. Let me give you some of the facts on that. They're talking about LiDAR supported autofocus plus new object detection. So previously, the other model, not so long ago, they introduced face detection on that camera, which was a big bonus. But now this one's gone to eye level detection, but it can also support detection of other objects as well. Let me go into the menu and show you that, because this is quite interesting. So I'm just going to tap into, actually I'll leave the screen closed for this, tap into the menu. If we go into the focusing, you can see we've got spot, expanded spot, we've got custom wide, but we've got human, cat, dog, or animal if you like, and vehicle, and the ability to turn that on or off, etc. in there as well. So the focusing options, if you like, greatly improved with that selection. Now, if I select human, what I noticed with it was that the eye detection was obviously something that we didn't have in the other model. It was more face detection. This has become a lot more accurate in finding the eye, locking onto the eye, focusing on the eye. And I've got some results that we're going to look at shortly to see how accurate that was. What I can tell you was it was more accurate than this one with the face detection, and it was more often more accurate as well, and it seemed to function pretty well. Now, admittedly, this is a medium format camera. it does not have the same sort of focusing speed and capabilities of the top-end 35mm cameras, because we're dealing with different types of lenses. We're dealing with lenses here that have got the leaf shutter in the lens, heavier glass, heavier lenses compared to smaller 35mm, more compact formats. So it's not competing with that sort of speed, but as a medium format camera, it's a huge jump up from the X2D. It's talking about high precision focusing. Continuous focusing is one of the other improvements here. So objects can be moving towards you, and it's got a detection system. According to the specs, it's using LiDAR as well for that. And the hardware, software, potentially maybe it's using some sort of AI calculations as well in there. I don't know. All I can tell you is that now it's got 425 focus points. I can't remember what the old one has, but this is a big increase in the number of focus detection points that you can select from. Now, it wasn't bang on every single shot, okay? There's no way I can tell you that every single fashion shot I took, it locked on focus perfectly. But the new feature of the joystick is a huge plus, because now not only is the joystick usable for menus and stuff, so I could be in the menus and I can use the joystick to move around my selection of items in the menus, but not only do we have that capability with the joystick, which wasn't there obviously on the previous model because it didn't have a joystick, but when we're actually looking at shooting a picture, we can at least move the focus zone quite quickly and easily, rather than have to press a button on the front and then use the scroll wheel here and the scroll wheel here, which was a method you could use on this camera by pressing that button lower down there and using the scroll wheels, but it was a bit sort of clunky doing that. So now I've got the ability to, if my focusing isn't locking on properly, is to move the focus zone closer to where my model's face or head is going to be in my composition, and then I found it locked on more easily. So it's almost like if it is struggling in certain situations with focusing, using the joystick to guide the focus to at least the right area seemed to help dramatically. And when I found using the camera in the studio, so let's say for instance I was doing beauty images on a white background and smooth, simple backgrounds, focusing locked on most of the time, no problem at all. So my success rate in on-point focus shots, when you've got a model turning her head or moving around into different poses, my success rate was far greater on this camera than it's ever been on this camera. On location, obviously we're dealing with different situations, from potentially very low light to busy backgrounds with high contrast and things that can kind of trick the focusing system and cause it not to be as accurate. So there were situations on location where it didn't lock on as well, but certainly locked on better than the previous model. But having that joystick allowed me to quickly move the focus zone over the area where I needed it to be, and then it locked on. So I was super, super happy about that. As a matter of fact, out of everything on this camera, we're going to come to image performance and image quality, etc. soon, but everything on this camera, that joystick and new focusing for me is the big, big plus. It's the one thing in my work, especially on location or beauty fashion shoots in the studio, it's the one thing in my work that really makes the difference, because you've all done it, you know, you've got your lighting set up, you've put all the work, you've got beautiful model, makeup, hair and everything done. You're doing the shoot and you think, oh wow, that's great, that shot. And then when you really zoom in, you're like, oh, it's not quite pin sharp because the focus missed it slightly. And it was that one shot where the pose was perfect and you're thinking, oh, that would have been the shot. Now, the success rate is so much higher. And that for me is a massive takeaway, because we know Hasselblad are going to deliver great image quality. That's not going to be an issue, but that focusing is a huge takeaway. The tilt screen thing is a massive plus as well, as I've just shown you, but it's the focusing in combination with that joystick that is the big plus. Now, of course, you can use the joystick to do other features and menu selections, etc., which makes the user interface a lot better, a lot more friendly. But again, that's not really a major thing for me. It's all about that focusing. So I'm going to say that that's the biggest, best improvement for me on this camera. Now, incidentally, while we're on the subject of the joystick and buttons, etc. on the camera, there is one thing that still really annoys me about this camera that I've mentioned to Hasselblad about the previous camera, and that is that in manual mode, when I'm using this camera, obviously I've got the aperture adjustment here, I'm in full manual, and I've got the shutter speed adjustment here. Now, when I shoot in full manual, working with flash on location, as in some of the test shoots, I set my exposure settings and that's it. I set it, let's say f11, 3/50th of a second, whatever ISO, boom, I'm shooting and I'm focused on shooting. I'm not thinking about the exposure anymore because I know that everything is right. The only exposure I'm concentrating on is the change in exposure of my studio flash or location flash lighting, which I can adjust from the trigger on that I put on top of the camera. So I'm forgetting about the camera settings. But what's happened in the past in the studio and on location is that as I'm working, I accidentally knock a wheel and you might move the aperture by a stop, or you change the shutter speed, which is going to affect the amount of ambient light coming in. Now, I've asked on this camera to set a lock button. They've got a custom feature button. They've got other custom options as well. I can't see why it's not possible to put the ability to lock the wheels so that when you turn them, they don't do anything and maybe a little padlock symbol came up. They used to have that on the H6 camera, and it doesn't seem like a major ask in terms of maybe a firmware update. I've just checked the latest firmware update for 1.1.8.6, and it's not listed on there because I was using the camera on a previous firmware. So I thought maybe they've done it because I did feed back to them on the beta testing, but it doesn't appear to be on the list. There is something here saying fixed accidental parameter changes caused by overly sensitive front and rear scroll wheels. I've just uploaded that firmware and can't see any difference between that and this. So I don't know whether, if that is going to be introduced, but it certainly should, because it's a very frustrating problem for me in the way that I work. One other minor thing that I've been asking for during beta testing on this model and previous models is the ability to change the wheels. So here we've got shutter speeds, and here we've got aperture. And I would like the ability to switch them around so that I can choose the front one to be shutter and the rear one to be aperture, or the front one to be shutter, knowing I can use the control ring here, which can allow you to do aperture on this one. And then that would give me a really perfect solution of shutter speed here, aperture there. And again, on the old H6 camera, you had the ability to flick them around. So again, it's something that I think it doesn't seem like it should be a major ask. I'm not an electronics technician or scientist by any means, but it seems to me something that seems quite simple that would make a huge difference, I think, for a lot of users. Now, also on the firmware update that I've just uploaded before we started doing this review here, but I didn't have it during the shoots, it's mentioning some improved performance on eye detection for focus accuracy success. So, even though I had the occasional problem with focusing, it may be that those things have been addressed in this firmware update, but I've yet to use the camera on location because when we were doing these tests over the last couple of months, I was on a previous firmware version. The next thing is stabilization. So what Hasselblad are saying is that they've got a 5-axis 10-stop IBIS stabilization in here now, and they're saying that's going to allow you to shoot into super low light or long exposure situations and still do it handheld. I put that to the test. Interestingly, it's not a feature that I ever really used even on this camera, which also has the stabilization, but it's improved on this camera. I always shoot on location with a tripod or with sufficient studio lighting, flash lighting on location, that my shutter speeds don't really need to go that low. On occasion where I am shooting long shutter speeds on, say, a landscape shot, where I might be shooting 2-3 seconds, I've got the camera on a tripod anyway. So it's not normally within my working sort of parameters, but I did deliberately put it to the test to see whether it worked. And we're going to look at those results when I come round to the images. We're just going to go through all of these specs first of all. The next thing is continuous shooting. This is something important that I tested, and compared to the previous model is a big improvement. The continuous shooting speed is now claimed to be just around 4 frames per second if you're in manual focus. Slightly slower if you're in autofocus. I think it's 3.8 seconds with continuous autofocus, which is obviously a new feature as well. But if we're talking about using the camera in continuous shooting mode, that continuous shooting mode, same system in the menus, etc. there, we've now got a faster shooting rate. Now, that, of course, is nowhere near the shooting rate of the top-end 35mm cameras that are shooting, 10, 20 frames per second. But this is, again, it's a medium format camera. But what it does give me the ability to shoot more rapidly on a fashion shoot where the model's throwing different poses, and to be able to fire off more shots than I could with the previous model. So that for me, again, is only a plus. So that's definitely a benefit in there. We're going to move on to image quality. There's a few features that they said to me, oh, we've put this in now, to do with Hasselblad's natural color system with HDR. And to be honest, it's of not any real consequence to me. They've introduced HDR features so that high dynamic range images can be displayed in a JPEG format on the back of the camera across devices like mobile phones for social media and all the rest of it. But that's not how I use this camera. That's not a feature that even bothers me. The display screen has got 1400 nit brightness on the OLED rear screen, which I think is an improvement over the previous one. And HDR photos can now be displayed through that and on the mobile app. But I'm not interested in that. I'm shooting in RAW file format always, and I'm processing my raw file images in the proprietary software called Focus that Hasselblad make, and I'm dealing with my dynamic range and everything within my raw file before I process and export it as a TIFF or a PSD. But they're saying here this is the first end-to-end HDR camera enabling export to Ultra HDR JPEGs and HDR HEIF format photos. If that's of use to you, great, but not something that is of significant interest to me, if at all. Let's move on to the actual camera sensor. So it is a new sensor. It's still 100 megapixels, but it is a new sensor. All of you know the sensors in the Hasselblad camera are made by Sony, and Hasselblad take those sensors and then they fine-tune them, tweak the color, their algorithms, their processing to get that beautiful sort of lovely analog film color look that Hasselblad are renowned for. So it has that beautiful filmic analog look to the files and not that horrible digital over sharpened look that we see on some of the other medium format cameras, in my opinion. So that's maintained, but this is a new sensor in terms of the type of sensor, but it is still 100 megapixels. Now, interestingly, the crucial thing for me was to discover whether or not image quality has changed because of a new sensor, because that's the fundamental, most important thing to me. You know, these are just tools to me. I really couldn't care less whether I was using a Sony, a Canon, a Fuji, or whatever. I'm only interested in ultimate image quality. And that is why I use the Hasselblad system for their, you know, natural color system, for the quality of their optics and the images that they deliver. So I'm only interested in image quality. So of course, the tests that I wanted to undertake were this camera versus this camera. And I'm pleased to say that in the areas I'm going to be using it, in the usual base sort of ISO levels, the native ISO levels, this camera performs equally exactly the same as this. As a matter of fact, I couldn't tell any difference between the image quality on these two until we get into some slightly higher ISO areas, which we're going to come to afterwards. But again, I need to look at the images with you. I'm going to save that because I'm going to delve into the raw files and open up some shots that we've took, etc. So let's just get down this list first of all. So it's a 100 megapixel sensor, CMOS, 15.3 stop dynamic range, 16-bit color depth. Its native ISO is 50. The native ISO on the X2D was 64. However, I only really use this camera at 100 ISO, and I'm probably still going to use this camera at 100 ISO because whilst 50 ISO might be the premium dynamic range and quality, 50 ISO for me is a little bit low because essentially you're losing one stop there from 50 to 100. So if I'm in the studio and I decide I'm going to shoot at 50, then all of my lights need to go up by one stop to compensate compared to 100. So I was especially concerned, well, what does this look like at 100 ISO compared to this at 100 ISO? I'm pleased to say there's no difference whatsoever. We'll come to that again when we look at the test results. But for some photographers, having lower ISO, they actually prefer it. There are situations where you want to allow for more light basically coming into the camera without having to add an ND filter or a situation like that. So that may be of use to some people. There's some nonsense here about the new Focus Mobile 2 app. Blah de blah. I don't really use it. I use the camera on location like that with the solid state drive. That's the other great thing I love about this camera. It's got a solid state drive, 1 terabyte built in. You can put memory cards in the camera here as well, but I don't need to because I shoot straight to the 1 terabyte solid state drive. The images are on there and then I offload them out of the USB-C port on the side when I get back to my studio. And if I'm shooting in the studio, I'm shooting tethered via the USB-C, and the tethering takes the images straight through the software and into my computer hard drive. If you're a photographer that's particularly worried about images and security, then you could opt to put the memory card in the camera and shoot to the solid state at the same time. I'm pretty sure that function is allowable. It was on the previous version. So that could be an option if you want that extra level of security. Battery life we've covered. It says interactive vibration feedback on some of the touch interactions. Didn't notice it, didn't use it. And then that main joystick button, which allows you more functionality. And then there's another button at the back here as well. I think it can be used as a custom button. You can see it here. So if we look at the previous model, there's no button. Let me just see if I can get this in a position where you can see both. There's no buttons on the back of the original camera, and there are now 2 buttons on the back of the new one. The top one is the joystick button, which we already covered, and the bottom one, I think, is a custom button. Let's just have a look actually, because I don't really know what that second button is for. Oh yeah, look, it's a custom button, so I can press it and it will go to a particular feature, but apparently you can program that to suit. So the joystick though for me is that main key thing, and the fact that you can use the joystick to navigate around the menu, superb. So that joystick, do you know what, it's kind of weird, right? Because when I was doing the beta testing and they said to me, these are all the new things that we'd like you to test and go through, feedback report, blah, blah, blah. I didn't think the joystick button was going to be much of a thing for me at all. And it actually turned out to be one of the premium upgrades and improvements that has helped my shooting workflow. So that joystick button I'm super, super happy about, which is, you know, a real big bonus. What else is there? Apparently there's now a countdown indicator light for self-timer, selfie type shots, blah-de-blah, blah. Right, those are the main things. There are some things to talk about with this lens, but let's deal with the lens in the second part of this video. I know a lot of you are going to be interested in this new 35 to 100 lens. Again, this really impressed me, that lens, with my test results, especially considering the pricing, which we'll come to as well. Right, so that's all of my notes covered on key new features. As I said, if you're interested in the overall features, then you'll have to revert to the original video that we've got, which covers all of that. So this is just the new features we're talking about. Here, I've got a list of notes of ISO comparisons that we're going to come to as well. But first of all, let's just go and look at some images that I've shot, because image quality for me is everything. And these are images where I've used obviously the new autofocus features, etc. And we'll take a look at what's going on here. Look at this for image quality. I mean, this is outstanding. I am now at 200% in on my screen on this image file. If you've got any idea of the sort of magnification we're looking at there, so that's 100%, but let's just keep zooming out. That's my full shot area. So you can see that resolution is insane. But not only that, the thing about the Hasselblad is just that incredible tonal value and silkiness of the images, the shadow, the skin tones, the color, everything is just sublime as expected. Now, actually I shot these images with the new Broncolor Stellos light. So this is a single studio light, the new Stellos lithium battery light in a Para 88, one light on the model. And I'm using my common technique, as I do in many of my fashion images, to underexpose the daylight and then add studio flash lighting into the scene as well, which is what I've done there. If we just take a quick look at the file info, this was shot on the 20 to 35 lens. And I've really been putting this lens through its paces lately. And this lens is astounding. We're going to look at something else to do with that soon. So I'm shooting this shot's at 100 ISO at f8. and 3/50th of a second was my shutter speed. But f8, we can see the sort of depth of field range that we're getting. Obviously back here, it's not in the focus zone, but it's in the focus zone on those railings, and it's in the focus zone up to her hand. So f8 was sufficient for me. It's in the focus zone on that pillar just above her head as well. But, you know, as usual with the Hasselblad image quality, blown away by the image quality there. That's at 100 ISO. So I've got no issues with this camera being a 50 ISO native ISO, because they're at 100 ISO, no problem at all. Let's move on to a couple of others from the same set. So there's another one here. Beautiful results, beautiful detail. And another one here, same set of shots that I did. Let's take a look at this one here. So I've got my two models in the sea. I have my assistant holding the Para 88, shining it at the models. Let's take a zoom in again. Look at that level of detail. We are at 200% there. We've got incredible detail, beautiful color rendition, skin tones, perfect, both models, sharpness, everything absolutely beautiful. So image quality, and this is also corner to corner quality as well. And that's one of the things actually that impressed me with the new, well, relatively new 20 to 35 lens, was my ability to shoot these images with the wide angle lens. It's a wide angle zoom 20 to 35. I haven't really spoken much about this lens, but this is actually fast becoming one of my favorite lenses. I normally shoot fashion on 55 or 90mm focal length, but because I was shooting two models at the same time for these test shots, these were actually also test shots for the Broncolor Stellos light. So I wanted to shoot two models, show what we could do with just relatively simple lighting, one modifier, and look at the results of this lens, right? Look at this corner to corner sharpness and the depth of field. This one's at f11, but look at the depth of field that this lens provides. Look at her shoes and look at her shoes. Look at those rocks. Look at the texture and the detail in the fabric. Look at the material on the handbags. Both models are sharp. Karis's eyes are sharp. Sylvia's eyes are sharp. Even the distant rock in the background and the horizon's relatively sharp. These rocks behind, which are a couple of meters behind, are sharp. This one is as well. So f11 on, I mean, obviously we know that a wide angle lens has naturally greater depth of field than telephoto lenses because magnification is reduced, but to get corner to corner sharpness and get that sort of depth of field pin sharp throughout, blown away by this 20 to 35 lens. Now, why am I talking about that when we're meant to be reviewing the X2D II and the new lens? The reason is because I haven't really spoken about this lens in any other tests that I've done, and I think seeing as I used it extensively because I had the need to use it, I thought let's mention, I love photography obviously, and I love seeing things work really well, and this works really well. The other thing, if we go back from a sensor point of view, in terms of dynamic range and what the camera captures, I know we've got flash in here, but look at shadow detail, tonal range. Look at the range of vibrant colors we're dealing with here across the board, from this sort of fluorescent pink to these textures in the rocks. You know, and I can pull out detail out of those shadows more if I wanted to. Handling highlights as well. Handling the highlights on the skin and the sky and everything else. You know, my tonal range from this sensor, absolutely amazing. Right, okay, now we're going to talk about low light performance and focus performance now, because that was what I put to test with this lens and also the 90mm lens. And I started to understand how much better the focusing was than this camera, but also what its limitations were. So let's dive into some of those test shots that we used here. So I'm going to open up, these are just PSDs exported from the raw files. So these haven't had anything done to them. They're just boom, straight out of camera exports. So let's just take a look at the file info. File info on this one. So this is the 35 to 100 lens that you can see here, X2D Mark II, 1/60th of a second at f4, 200 ISO, and I'm using it at around at the 100mm end of the focal length. Now, shooting 1/60th of a second is quite low when you're hand holding 100mm focal length. If you go back to the old sort of rule of thumb before image stabilization, you shouldn't really use a shutter speed that was less than the actual focal length. So if you're using a 200mm lens, you shouldn't use a shutter speed less than 1/200th of a second. That was a good rule of thumb. Obviously, as you become, you know, more adept at photography and professional with your skills, you can hand hold lower. And now image stabilization allows you to bring that down even more. So I was testing that image stabilization by deliberately using slow shutter speeds, and we go even slower than that as well. But here, it was more about the focusing to see how well this new 35 to 100 lens actually focuses as well. So let's take a look. Pin sharp. Look at that. That's 60th of a second on a 100mm lens, handheld, as that sun's going down, on the shadow side of the model. This is just natural light, these, didn't use any studio lighting. And the detail of this lens is incredible. Now let me tell you why it's incredible. First of all, I picked this lens up and I thought, oh, it's quite big, but it is a medium format lens. All medium format lenses are bigger than an equivalent 35mm because they've got a leaf shutter inside to allow you that any flash sync speed that you want. They're bigger glass because they've got to project an image onto a bigger sensor, etc., etc. This isn't too bad in weight. And if you think about what this lens could replace, this is 35 to 100, right? This is how it extends out, 35 to 100. The cost of this lens is apparently $5,500. But I've got a 90mm prime lens here that costs $4,300. I've got a 55mm prime lens here that costs $3,700. And a 38mm prime lens that's $3,700. So if you wanted to work with 3 prime lenses to cover the range that that's costing, you're going to be getting to well over $10,000 for those 3 lenses. And this lens covers 35 to 100 for $5,500. And it's a 2.8 to f4. So it's a variable aperture. So at 35mm end, it will be an f2.8 maximum aperture, and at 100, it'll be f4. Now, if you compare that to the previous lens, the 3570 in the lineup, that was f3.5 to f4.5, and that lens cost $5,100. So this is an exceptionally good value lens with exceptional image quality. If we look at that image quality again, look at that level of detail that this lens is providing. I was not expecting the lens quality to be as high as it was for the price of that lens. I know Hasselblad are renowned for their glass, for creating incredible lenses. But I honestly wasn't expecting this lens to be as good as it is, given the range of the zoom, because normally a greater zoom range means more lens optical problems to overcome with the elements and the configurations of them. So we have a large zoom range, but delivering what I can only describe as prime lens performance. Now, if you were to say to me, would I have this lens instead of these? The answer would be no. Because one, I'm a professional photographer and I can afford to purchase the individual lenses. And for me, I prefer the weight of shooting with a more compact lens and a prime lens. Equally, the 90mm, which is, you know, my favorite lens, is a 2.5. So obviously that's at the 90mm focal length, whereas I'd be at f4 at 100mm on that one. The 55mm lens is a 2.5. I think the 35mm lens is a 2.8. And then I've got a 20 to 35, which is actually below the range of that one anyway, so you can't really consider that as part of that. So I would still choose to shoot with prime lenses as a professional, and I would actually, and now I'm going to, is have two camera bodies and have the longer focal length short telephoto 90mm on there and the 20 to 35 on the other, and you can just switch between cameras. But for a photographer who just wanted one lens and the lower budget of that lens, but still wanted that Hasselblad image quality, this thing delivers. Really, really impressed with that. And as you can see, the results here. And then if you couple that with the image stabilization and the fact that I shot this at 100mm handheld at 60th of a second and it's 200 ISO, I think we can agree that that's a stunning result. Let's take a look at some more. So the focusing, as you can see from locking onto that eye, was absolutely pin sharp. Let's look at another one. This is very low light now. I think that I can't remember exactly. Let's check the settings here. I'm at 1/45th of a second now. f4, because we're at the 100mm end of the focal length. 200 ISO still, but now at 1/45th of a second. Look how sharp that eye is and how sharp those eyelashes are. I'm at 1/45th of a second handheld with 100mm, and the focusing is absolutely pin sharp bang on. Very, very happy about that. So where were there situations where the focus struggled? Well, there was this one. This one is actually sharp, but it's not quite as pin sharp. And I do remember from some of the files it didn't lock on straight away. But this is an extreme situation. I've got the sun directly behind my model's head, super bright light wrapping around her. She was pretty much silhouetted, so the camera was having to try and find focus in the silhouette, which is hard to do by, you know, for most cameras, I would imagine. And it did struggle with that on a couple of the shots, but it did also find it assisted with the joystick and getting the joystick near the eye. Then it knew what it was looking for. So that's one situation where I spotted it struggled. Let's move on to another shot here. So let's look at the file info. So we are now, this one is, oh actually this is now with my 90mm lens at full aperture f2.5, 90th of a second, 200 ISO. Again, I wanted to test the focusing not just on that lens, I wanted to see it on some of my existing lenses. This is an interesting one because she's side on, and I was kind of worried, is the eye focus going to lock on? But yes, look at it, pin sharp, locked on beautifully. And again, this is very low light situation, doesn't necessarily look it in that resulting image. This is just natural light. But let's go further because I've got some quite impressive results here. Let's go zoom in on this one. Pin sharp, no problem at all. Pin sharp, but what is impressive about this is if we go into file info, this is the 90mm lens on the X2D II camera at 90th of a second at f2.8. But here's the important thing. This is at 1600 ISO. Now at 1600 ISO, where's my noise? Look at this. Now some of this is down to camera processing or the raw camera file software processing, but the result nonetheless is stunning. I'm shooting at 1600 ISO. I could get away with that ISO for an advertising shot on a product in the studio, that the result is so good. Now obviously at that increased ISO, dynamic range isn't as good, there's other factors, etc. But the ability to shoot at 1600 ISO, which is something I never do because I never need to, because I use mostly studio lighting so I can work at my native or 100 ISO. But there we've got a shot at 1600 ISO in very low light conditions. The sun had already gone down now, we're into the dark, but the exposure looks good because of the settings that I applied to lift the image up essentially in camera, and obviously using 1600 ISO and the focusing bang on. But what I did notice as we started to get into that really dark twilight, the camera did struggle more with the focusing. So the success rate was not as high. This one is pin sharp. But again, what are we into here? I think the reasons this one might not look quite as sharp is the low shutter speed. Yeah, here we go, look. This is incredible. 90mm focal length at 1/20th of a second at f2.8. This one's at 800 ISO. So if any of you that understand photography and exposure level in relation to shutter speed, apertures, ISO, you would know that to shoot at 20th of a second, 2.8 and 800 ISO, you can imagine how dark it was in real terms on that scene. And yet the camera delivers that 20th of a second handheld with a 90mm lens. I've never really rated this whole camera stabilization thing because I'm a studio photographer most of the time, so it's not something that I ever thought I really needed. But you know what? Being able to go outdoors and shoot location images of models, people, etc., and confidently go, you know what? I can shoot at 20th of a second. I can even shoot at 10th of a second handheld because the image stabilization is doing such a good job. That is an amazing bonus. Now, I've heard Hasselblad claim that you can shoot with this thing at 2 seconds or maybe more handheld. I personally don't buy it. However, I guess it depends on what lens you're using. If you're using a short telephoto like a 90mm or 100mm, I can't see that being a reality. However, when we're using super wide angle lenses like a 20 to 35, which is I think equivalent to about 16mm in 35mm format, we're reducing the magnification immensely in comparison to a 90mm lens. And therefore camera shake becomes less because magnification is less. When we use longer focal length lenses, we're magnifying, so any camera movement is magnified as well. So it may well be that on super wide angle lenses, you can get down to ridiculously slow handheld shutter speeds. That's not something I tested because it's not something I would use, because if I was using 2 or 4 seconds, it's going to be in a long exposure landscape with moving water and that sort of thing. So I'm going to opt for a tripod anyway. Right, so let's keep looking at some of these results. So the next test shot here, you can see how dark it is here. Look, the lights inside this building in the background, how bright they are relative to the scene. So you imagine like if it was daylight, those lights wouldn't show up. But I'm making the scene look brighter because of the exposure setting that I've got. And that exposure setting here, wow, look at this one. 1/10 of a second, f2.8, and on a 90mm at 100 ISO. So let's dig into that. 800 ISO shot. Noise looks amazingly clean. I mean, there is some grain there, but the post-processing on the noise has worked really well. It's not as pin sharp as some of the others, but I am down to 1/10 of a second now, handheld with a 90mm lens, virtually in the dark, and able to get that result. So that was an eye-opener for me. One more to look at here as well. Let's look at the file info again, because I know all you nerds want to see that stuff. 90mm, 20th of a second, 2.5, 1600 ISO. Let's take a look at the shot. Pretty sharp, pretty damn sharp throughout, pretty low levels of noise throughout, and focus accuracy. Now, as I said, I'm not going to claim that this camera locked on focus on the eye perfectly in every single situation, because it did not. In the studio, it did an amazing job with clean backgrounds. On location, it did an amazing job. Occasionally, it got confused by a background and you had to move the joystick into position to help it. In low light, its success rate became less than optimum compared to normal lighting conditions. But again, I found using that new joystick feature and just, knocking the focus point across to the area you're shooting, that gave me better results throughout. Right, so we've sung the praises of the image quality compared to the original X2D. We've sung the praises of this 2035 lens and this new 35-100. I've got one ghost in the machine that we need to dig out that I had some concerns about. I'm going to come to those at the end or soon in this review. Before we do, let's take a look at this 35-100. I'm going to go through the spec sheets of this. Then we're going to look at ISO tests, side-by-side comparison, these two cameras. So what have I got here given to me, the standard spec list from Hasselblad. This is equivalent in 35mm terms to a 28-80. The optical quality is superb. We know it's a 2.8 to f4. High image quality, beautiful bokeh they're saying, blah, blah, blah. Excellent internal focusing design, optical design, yeah, we've covered that. Fast, accurate focus experience, we've covered that. High-speed autofocus motors. That actually is something that was impressive with this. For a lens of this size, the speed of the focusing was also, you've got motors in there to power those elements and move them around. The speed of the focusing was good. You obviously have manual focusing on there as an option as well on all these lenses if you want it. Keep in mind the lenses, they have to be a given size because Hasselblad's lenses have a leaf shutter in the lens. The shutter is not in the camera. A leaf shutter, which is different, say, to the Fuji system, the leaf shutter being in the lens allows me the opportunity to shoot at any flash sync speed I want. So if I'm on location in the middle of the day, like I was with some of those shots of the girls on the rock, I can be shooting at 3/50th of a second, 500th of a second, even 4,000th of a second shutter speed and still sync my flash and get the shot with flash as well. That's the beauty of leaf shutters. Unfortunately, it makes the lenses more expensive, but there we go. So that's about it with the lens. So let's move on to ISO tests. So we're going to look at the raw files in the Focus software first of all, because I discovered something interesting. The files, because I'm normally shooting tethered, or even when I'm offloading the files from the camera solid state drive into Focus software. Focus software, for those of you that don't understand, is the software that Hasselblad have built and created. I've used it for decades. I really love it. I also use Capture One, but I actually prefer Focus software. It doesn't have all that nonsense catalog system that you've got to figure out where your files are and all that stuff. I just create my own file structures and folders based on my clients and the dates I shot. I just want to deal with the raw imaging, and the raw image processing in the Focus software is superb. So what I did was I set up a studio scenario, still life as you can see here, and that studio still life scenario remained the same. I've got a color checker card in there, and I shot 50 ISO versus 64, 100 versus 100, 200 versus 200, 400 versus 400, and so on, right up to like 25,600 ISO to see whether there was any changes in image quality, which is obviously the most important thing to me, but also to take a look at the ISO performance, because this being a new sensor, my expectations were that the ISO performance may be improved because it was already excellent on this as well. So let's take a look at that. So first of all, I'm going to compare files number, I've got some notes here because I took so many pictures I had to remember what's what. So I'm going to find file number 386. So 386 is on the X2D Mark I at 100 ISO. I'm going to put that side by side. So it's on the left here now. And I'm going to go and find image 453, which is that one. So on the left is the X2D, and on the right is the X2D Mark II. And we go into the images, and you can't see a jot of difference. There is absolutely no difference whatsoever in anything on these files. The image could be taken on the same camera. The image quality, dynamic range, exposure, all of the rest of it, it's all looks the same. So fantastic. I was like, amazing. I use the cameras mostly at 100 ISO, so I'm super happy to see that nothing changes there. I tested it on 50 ISO versus 64. Let's take a look at that. So we want file 389, which you can see there is the X2D 100, the original camera, at 64 ISO. It's native ISO. So I'm going to put this in compare mode, so that'll go on the left. Now I need to find file number 450, which is there. So 450 is now on this side here. And let's take a look. So we've got 64 ISO on the left, 50 ISO on the right. Again, I didn't really notice any major difference here. There may be the possibility that highlight tones have got a little bit more captured, if you like, dynamic range in them on the new model. But there's no difference in sharpness, there's no difference in color, everything remains the same. And let's just zoom out to a sort of mid-range zoom and move this around. So that area in there. So we've got the X2D original camera at 64 ISO on the left, and we've got 50 ISO on the right. Nothing at all to notice different there. For those of you that, well, how are you getting the exposure right? This is with Studio Flash. So I'm adjusting the power of the flash when I'm having to change to different ISOs to maintain the correct exposure for the image. So, all good. Right, here we find the ghost in the machine. 1600 ISO and above, I noticed something interesting. Let's go to shot 404, which is the X2D original one. There, 404, let me just zoom in on that, prove to you. X2D original, and as you can see here, 1600 ISO f11. And the shot 435, let me find that. they all went out of sequence because software was getting confused because I was switching between two different cameras. You can see this is the X2D Mark II, 1600 ISO at f11. So that's shot 435. So I'm going to go back to shot 404, and I'm going to put shot 404 on the left. That's my choice shot here. That's that, and that's both of them there now. And then I'm going to put shot 435 on the right. So we now have the X2D II on the right-hand side and the X2D on the left-hand side, both of them at 1600 ISO. Let's zoom in. No noticeable difference whatsoever. Grain structure, very tight, very good. Again, you know, considering we're at 1600 ISO, all looks pretty smart. Let's move up to this area here. Grey, neutral tone, mid-tone's always a good area to spot sort of noise in those lower light. But actually, the image on the right looks minor. I'm just going to change glasses here so I can have a proper. It looks a minor amount superior or about the same. But above 1600 ISO, I noticed that the noise on the new camera looked slightly different. Not worse, not better, but slightly different structure to the noise. So there's something going on with this new sensor, because remember it's a different sensor, it's not the same 100 megapixel sensor, it's a different new Sony sensor. There's something going on with that in the higher ISOs that's causing a difference. Now the thing to consider though here is that this is with Hasselblad's Focus software post-processing or in-camera processing and then Focus software processing that noise, and it does an incredible job on it. So, you know, if you're only interested in the end results, you don't really have anything to worry about anyway because the processing on the noise is superb. But let's get to the 12,800 ISO shot, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you the image files without the post-processing because I took them into another camera raw editor where it won't apply the post-processing, so I could check that noise properly. So on 12,800 ISO on this one, it was file 410. Let's just come out of this a second. Let me find file 410. 410. Right, now here is file 410 on the X2D at 12,800 ISO. I'm never going to shoot at 12,800 ISO, by the way, but just so you know, this is the result with post-processing on the X2D. Let me find the X2D II file, which is file 425, and I'm putting file 425 on the right. And here, I thought there's more noise in the X2D II file at 12,800 ISO than there was on the X2D. Let's zoom out one click. I think you should be able to just about see it. The post-processing deals with a lot of it, and I'm sure Hasselblad will continue to refine things even further. But if we look at the camera, also keep in mind, this is a beta version of the camera. They've told me it essentially is the same as the final thing, which they always upgrade things with firmware, etc. as we go. But if we look at that, we can see more noise in the green there, and we can see more noise in the orange for sure. And this is now at 12,800 ISO. So what we're seeing for me, which I thought this is a little bit concerning, is that there's actually more noise at the higher ISOs than there is on this one. Now the reason for that, in my guess is, I'm not a scientist by any means, but my guess is that that's because the native ISO of this camera is lower, it's 50. And the native ISO on this one is 64. And that native ISO means that therefore each ISO step up is a sort of bigger step, if you like. So we can see some noise difference there. So essentially, the older model at very higher ISO is currently, in comparison to this beta camera that I've got here, delivering less noise. No difference whatsoever up to 1600 ISO. So don't be worried about this in any way whatsoever up to 1600 ISO. And even at 1600 ISO, it's virtually invisible. It's only when we get up into these really high ISOs, like 12,800 or 25,600, that we start to see something. So I thought, I wonder how much of this is actually post-processing by the software. So what I did was I then took the image files and I wanted to take a look at them. So here are two image files. I made copies of the raw files. Remember, 386 is the one from the original camera and 453 is from the new camera. So 386 is, as you can see at the top there, the X2D, and that's the X2D Mark II. Now you'll notice that the color shifts. There's a lot more red, but there's not a problem with the red. It's just simply that Adobe's Camera Raw does not have the color profile associated with this camera where it does for the X2D. So ignore that, because obviously, as you saw in the Focus software, there's no difference whatsoever. But let's just take a look at the, what we're concerned about is noise and if there's any difference. Now, interestingly, and this is really important to me, the new camera is better and smoother noise, smoother grain than the old one at 100 ISO. And I think that's super important because that's where I'm going to be using it. I'm going to be using it in that 100 or 50 to sort of 400, maybe even 800 area. And as you saw the results with Karis on the beach, we did shoot some at 1600 ISO and the results looked amazing. So it's only really, I'm making an issue about this, but it's not really an issue unless you're really adamant you're taking pictures only at 1600 ISO and above, which I doubt anyone would. So here, the new camera, in my opinion, at 100 ISO is actually slightly better. But let's move on to the next one. So if we then go to 1600 ISO, and I take these two files into a different RAW engine, which doesn't apply noise processing to it. So I've got the X2D file here, as you can see at the top of the screen, and the X2D Mark II. Again, ignore the color, that makes no difference, just simply the profile isn't there in the Adobe Camera Raw. I want to look at noise. So that's the old camera, and that's the new camera. Now at 1600 ISO, not a great deal of difference. Just maybe a different type of noise. Remember I said the noise structure, the grain structure looked a little bit different. We can certainly see it in the mid sort of tone grey area here. If I flick between the two as quickly as possible, it's just a slightly different structure of the noise. So I wouldn't say there's more noise at 1600 ISO, just the way the noise looks is a little bit different. So nothing to worry about there. But if we go to 12,800 ISO, let's take these two files into the software, which is obviously not applying noise reduction. So I've got the X2D file there, as you can see at the top of the screen, and the X2D Mark II. Again, ignore the color differences, it's just the profile. So let's zoom in on this area. This is the X2D. Remember, this is 12,800 ISO, so it's going to be noisy no matter what. And that is on the new one. There's more noise at 12,800 ISO on the new camera than there is on the old camera. Not a lot. It's not a massive amount. And some of that noise seems to be more the structure of the grain rather than a massive increase in noise. Let's look at the color checker, because that's always a good one. So again, you can see here, greens, blues, oranges, It's just slightly different. And this is at 12,800. So there's not a lot to worry about here. Okay, I'm just pointing it out because people often criticize you as a Hasselblad ambassador, said, oh, you're always going to say good things about the camera because you're an ambassador. I can say whatever the hell I like, and I will, and I always will. I have complete independence, especially as an educator, to choose whatever I want to say. These guys trust me enough to know, well, it's not trust me enough, they trust themselves enough to know that their kit is going to deliver. And if I've got any issues, I'm reporting back to them during the beta testing anyway, saying, well, we need to look at that, this and the other. But I am super, super happy to say that this X2D Mark II is now my camera of choice because the focusing is the main thing for me. Focusing performance is absolutely a step up, all of the things I listed before. This 35-100 lens will be a premium choice for many photographers. Not for me, for the reasons I explained earlier, but it is an excellent lens that exceeded my expectations for a lens of that price with that focal range. I'm going to keep the original X2D Mark I because this is still an excellent camera. I can see a situation now where I can shoot with two cameras, one with one lens on and one with the other. But certainly for my fashion images, location images, shooting people, that focusing accuracy is a big plus for me. In the studio where I'm shooting products, tethered, manually focused, it doesn't matter which camera I use, probably seeing the fact that results at 100 ISO look minusculely better than that camera, I'll choose to go with the X2D II anyway. So that's it, guys. I hope that comprehensive review is, you know, detailed and better than most of the other reviews you're going to find out there. That's my take on it. I think Hasselblad have delivered an absolute winner here. They've obviously listened to people, to people's concerns. And that joystick, I think, was something that people had requested. It wasn't something that I'd even really thought of as such, but now I can see that it is a huge benefit on the camera. But for me, the crucial and most important thing is the focusing. Obviously, faster frame rates is another big plus as well. So there are, you know, other features in there as well that you're going to find useful. Well, I hope you enjoyed looking at those images, test images, and hope you enjoyed this review of the new X2D Mark II. Thanks very much for watching.